Well, welcome everybody to Brian Decker's Capstone Defense. This is the 170th Capstone Defense in the MCM program. Capstone Defenses are the culmination of an MCM candidate's incredible journey of hard work and effort and dedication over a 2 or 3 year period. And this one is no different. The way today's run of show will work is, Brian, you'll have 25 minutes to present. Don't worry if you go a minute or two over or under, it doesn't matter. We're not too sticky about timing. After that, we will go in order with questions. So first we will go to your supervisor, who will have questions for you. Second, your second reader. After that, I, as chair of the session, have the option to ask a question if I decide to. Then we go to a second round of questioning where, again, your supervisor and your second reader get a chance to have a second go at you with questions. After that, we go to the gallery. So folks in the gallery, you are invited to make editorial comments, to critique or ask questions of the candidate as well. So without further ado, it's 10:33. So you have until about 10:28, 29 to present, Brian. And we look forward to your presentation.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Alex, for that introduction, and good morning to everyone. And thanks for joining me for this capstone presentation today, and I hope the culmination of my MCM journey. The study I'm gonna take you through today focuses on external social media as a tool for internal communication. It's a bit of a counterintuitive topic, and it's an understudied topic that nonetheless is emerging as something that's really important in the field of public relations and beyond. And so for today's presentation, I'll take everyone on a little bit of a journey to kind of understand this dynamic a bit better. That's going to include an overview of the research problem and the current literature relevant to the problem. And then I'll dive into the meat of the study, and we'll end up going over some key takeaways for where some future research might go and some practical implications for workers in the field. So a little bit more about this research. It was a qualitative research study, and what I really wanted to look at was the implications that organizations' social media strategies have on their internal stakeholders. So in other words, how does what organizations are doing on social media impact and interact with people like employees? And then to narrow the study down to a more appropriate scale, the study looked at post-secondary institutions in Ontario. As a bit of a background on this topic and why the study ended up where it did, the field of internal communication has been transformed by digital tools, and it's a flourishing topic in both academic literature and business media. It's something we touched on a fair bit in the MCM program. And so as a result of that flourishing, we've got extensive research on how organizational strategy in this field and the use of digital tools like email and instant messaging, how those tools impact internal stakeholders. But what we don't actually know a lot about is social media and its impact on these stakeholders, which that was a surprise to me when I first started diving into this topic. And so, in other words, what impact do the strategic choices that organizations make on social media have on what impact do those choices have on people like employees? There is really extensive literature on what's known as enterprise social media, and that's tools like Slack, Teams, company message boards, things like that. But surprisingly, there's actually very little research on how external social media, those are the ones we typically think of: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, how those can and often are internal communications tools. And part of that is obvious at first. These platforms are used to communicate with audiences that are, far and wide, and in many cases, thousands of times the size of those internal stakeholder audiences. And yet we know that internal stakeholders consume and view the content posted on these platforms by their employers. And so this study is all about exploring, that understudied dynamic in particular. What does the existing relevant literature kind of tell us about this field? What are the real world dynamics that workers in this field experience? What impacts might certain strategic choices have on employees? And ultimately, What are the areas ripe for further exploration that might further illuminate this topic? So looking at the research problem, once again, there has been extensive research on how digital technology has transformed internal communication, but very little on this specific niche of using external media or external social media as an internal comms tool. And the gaps exist for two main reasons. One is, number one, a focus on that aforementioned enterprise social media. And secondly, there are silos within different academic disciplines. And this isn't really a field that belongs to one area of study. And so that leaves us with a need for research that, instead of viewing it through the prism of a certain discipline, kind of takes into account how people who are actually working in the field approach this dynamic. And the answers to these problems and the research that comes out of it, that might be used to determine where we go from here. What are the most important things to be studied further to establish, a key understanding of this topic and really get to know it a little bit better. I wanted to take you a little bit through the research questions that the study focused on. And I wanted to reference these early on because they're going to be addressed in the results and discussion sections of the study. So just to paraphrase these, they're kind of long, so I'm going to paraphrase them. Who actually are the internal stakeholders at these institutions? How are these people considered in crafting organizational social media strategy? How do practitioners create content with these people in mind? And how and to what extent is the strategy impacted or influenced by other departments within an organization, like management or human resources? And so looking at the existing literature on this topic, I wanted to highlight a quote from Anna Tokalic-Vercic, who's one of the foremost scholars on internal communication. And that quote is, internal communication is simultaneously a part of various organizational functions and not really a part of any. And the takeaway from this quote is that, internal communication is performed by many different units within an organization, but it's not really owned by any one, such as, public relations or communications or HR. There's no best practice for who's supposed to own that. And that's a theme that I'm going to touch on frequently over the next few minutes because it's something that came up a lot in the study. So again, going over the literature review, I wanted to highlight some really important things that came out of it. And firstly, looking at internal communication as a discipline, the big takeaway is it's a growing field and it's present in multiple disciplines. Again, touching on that quote from the last slide. There are perspectives on this topic from public relations, psychology, human resources, business management, numerous other fields. And part of that reinforces the previous point that there's really no, consensus on who owns this as an organizational function. When it comes to internal communication over social media, there is plenty of research out there that shows the benefits of using enterprise social media for internal communication. There is a general consensus that it does things like, foster connectedness, give internal stakeholders purpose and meaning within their jobs, generating enthusiasm. But, you could maybe surmise that same dynamic is happening with external social media. That employees viewing their organization's social media content could create similar effects and dynamics. There just isn't actually research that either supports or refutes that idea. It's not really present in the literature, which was a bit of a surprise to me when I started on the journey of this study. Another topic I looked into a fair bit was this concept of social identity theory. And the reason I did that was, I wanted to explore a field that's somewhat outside the usual public relations genre. And this gets more into psychology. And, once again, there's a fair bit of research that shows that engagement with social media content in general, not in an employer-employee context, but just in general, that can foster belongingness, tribalism, building group cohesion. But what's missing is that research that says that from an employer-employee point of view. There is also a lot of research about social identity theory in the specific context of enterprise social media. So again, your Teams, Slack, employee message boards, that kind of thing. But again, it's not really in the literature about external social media. And the fact that this dynamic exists for social media in general, it suggests that it's likely for audiences like employees. But again, we don't know that. So in other words, thinking about what an employer posts on their Facebook page, motivating or even demotivating employees, as an example, we just don't have research that looks at that specifically. Another field where there's quite a lot of research into social media is human resources. And unlike the others, this is a field where the existing research does focus on external facing social media, your Twitters, Facebooks, LinkedIn's. But what you see in this field is really a focus on prospective employees. So, for example, studies that show what kind of content or brand voice helps, employers' recruitment efforts. But, studies that focus on the impact of social media on current employees are, remarkably absent from the existing research. Finally, because this study looks at Canadian universities and colleges, I wanted to see what research exists on the social media strategy of these institutions. And there was one study in particular, and a few others that have followed it, that suggests that mainly these institutions employ the same strategy as the corporate world. And what that means specifically is, content that broadcasts brand promises and is one way in nature, and it kind of eschews two-way communication. So, we've got a decent base of existing literature that says that, the strategies at these institutions kind of mirrors the corporate world. But again, what's missing here is the impact of that content on stakeholders, regardless of whether it's designed to be engaged with or not. Whether that content is meant to be, passively engaged or it's meant to, start a conversation, it's going to impact the way people feel about their employers either way. And that specific dynamic is what we don't really have a lot of research on right now. So the methodology of the study, the first was taking that literature review and kind of turning it into an extended literature review. And the second part of it was, taking the insights from that literature review and doing 10 in-depth interviews with social media practitioners at post-secondary institutions in Ontario. And the reason for these choices was, doing the literature review, not as a systematic review, but trying to find saturation in the themes I've just discussed. I tried to look at any branches of the literature that had even tangential value to the topic and tried to find where that reached dead ends. The in-depth interviews were conducted, kind of as a means of finding the real life dynamics that people who are working in the field now, kind of seeing if there were themes that came out of what people said. And finally, I picked Ontario universities and colleges because there's a rich selection of schools here in Ontario they're world class, and segmenting Ontario as the sample as opposed to all of Canada kind of helped limit the scope of the study to a reasonable scale. Reaching, call it 10 institutions out of 42. That provided maybe a bit more of a reasonable scale to maybe not draw some conclusions from, but have a bit more of a reliable, data in the study. And so the interviewees represented 7 different institutions. You'll notice that 6 of them are universities and 1's a college. I'm going to get into why about that in the limitations, but I wanted to show, where the institutions were of the people that I spoke to. And then importantly, the interviewees also came from a few different departments within those institutions. Most are responsible for running the main accounts that represent the entire institution. So, at McMaster, at Wilfrid Laurier. But, some of them came from individual faculties and even sub-departments. And this is important. I wanted to highlight this because I'm going to get into why and some of the differences that came out of these interviews in the results section. So getting into the results, I'm going to look at 6 key themes that came out of the interviews. And starting, I'm going to take a look at internal stakeholders and audiences. And one thing that was very clear in the interviews was that practitioners, by and large, didn't view internal communications as a big part of their role. And further to that, there wasn't even really any consensus on what exactly constitutes an internal stakeholder in the first place. I think it was notable that, a few interviewees considered students to be internal stakeholders, which that represents a bit of a departure from the literature and the way internal stakeholders are typically defined, which is usually as employees. And the main takeaway from this theme was that, internal communications and who's really in charge of it at the institutions is not really well defined across the industry. This was something that came up in almost every interview. The second theme that appeared was that staff and faculty are indisputably a part of the content strategy at these institutions. They're featured in a lot of content. And there are various reasons for this, but broadcasting institutional values externally, that's a big part of it. Even, inducing engagement rates and getting people, there's a lot of evidence that this kind of content generates a lot more, comments and engagement. Those are all reasons for doing that, but nobody actually identified actually talking to these people as a reason for producing this kind of content. And that was a big takeaway. Another theme that came up frequently was the systems that practitioners employ when engaging with internal stakeholder groups offline about the content that they're featured in. So, the back work that kind of goes into producing the content that I mentioned on the previous slide. There was no real consensus in what these systems and how people manage those conversations and what those kind of systems look like. And, some of them were very ad hoc, some of them were very sophisticated, but the big takeaway was that these practitioners all had systems, and that's because they're kind of forced to. These conversations happen a lot, whether they're kind of forced on them or whether they seek them out. It's something that these people spend a lot of time doing in their jobs. And so the fourth theme follows that previous point, and that's that practitioners needed to have a strategy in place for deflecting requests for certain types of social media content. So, for example, a professor asking their school for a LinkedIn post about the publishing of the 4th edition of their textbook, something like that. This scenario came up a lot where practitioners receive these requests that, they don't quite meet the threshold for, fitting their content strategy and needing to have a way to deal with that and needing to have a way to respond to that. Some workers describe content plans that provided them with the justification to just say no, while others describe needing to have alternative channels where that content can maybe be deflected to. The real theme of that is that every practitioner needs a system because these conversations with internal stakeholders, again, are part of their jobs. The fifth theme was that although sometimes there's content that's specifically geared towards internal stakeholders, an example of that could be, a blizzard closing campus and needing to tell people to stay home. Practitioners still generally try to stay away from using these platforms to reach those audiences because there's just too many people that content isn't relevant to. It just represents too small of a percentage of their overall followings. And finally, the sixth theme that came out of the interviews is that the participants reported a really high degree of autonomy in their departments. And I think that to tie it back to that Anna College quote that I had at the start of the literature review, there's a lot of siloing in internal communications. And that's really consistent with what these practitioners reported because they're not doing it in concert with other parts of the organization. And if it is happening at other parts of the organization, they don't really know about it because they don't view internal communications as part of their job. And so I broke out the analysis of the data and the themes that came out of it into two main themes. And those themes were the definition and relevance of internal stakeholders and internal stakeholder content and the involvement of outside departments. And firstly, one thing that really stands out is the inconsistent application. And frankly, you could even say the irrelevance of internal communications in the eyes of people working in this field. It's just not among the top priorities for many workers. It's not to say that they think it's not important for their organization, but they don't view it as their task. It's not something that they own. And that might be intuitive because, if you think you're working in social media, talking to, customers, students, the media, public officials, that's more important. And, it's just not among the top priorities for them. And it's certainly not conceptualized the same way as it is in the traditional literature. One exception to that I did want to mention was an interviewee I spoke with who worked in the office of a senior administration official. So, as opposed to workers representing the school's main channels, this worker said that, talking to internal groups over social and importantly, being seen as talking to these groups was a big priority for them. But that was really the exception and not the rule. And so I think that there's a real paradox here, which is that these workers spend a lot of time dealing with and communicating with these groups offline, but actually reaching them online, actually talking to them, that's not really present in their social media strategy. Secondly, leveraging internal stakeholder groups and creating content about them and content that features them to achieve their goals, it is a big priority for these workers. And based on these interviews, this practice does, anecdotally at least, it does have potential for two-way communication. And even, like I mentioned in the social identity theory section of the Lit review, it does have potential for, creating and strengthening identity among these workers. However, it's not what social media and communications teams are actually trying intentionally to do. It's not part of their mission. And so the paradox is that practitioners are actually doing internal communications. Like in some cases, they even know that they're doing it, but they don't own it. They don't view it as something that they like. They may know what's happening, but it's not something that they view as important to their job. It's not their responsibility to the organization. It's something that happens at most as a side benefit. So moving on to the discussion and some of the practical takeaways from the study, within the academic literature, there's a missing element about how social media strategy affects current internal stakeholders. And, clearly based on the interview results, there's a real need and a justification for that line of study. It's not something that's well understood. And there's also an open question, both within the literature and among the real practitioners, about whose responsibility that communication should be within an organization. The next theme for discussion is, it's notable that for most parts of these organizations, social media is mainly used kind of as a marketing tool, externally focused. But a thread worth pulling on is that senior administration official who I mentioned, working in that person's office, representing that person online. They said that being seen as speaking to internal audiences, the different faculties, the different, groups among the internal stakeholders on campus, they said that was part of their job. And it's interesting, finding, and it's worth exploring more about that dynamic and whether that plays out for different types of departments within an organization. Some of the interviewees I spoke to said that, between the different departments, faculties, sports teams, other things affiliated with the school, there are hundreds of social media accounts at these institutions. And how those different accounts approach this question of internal stakeholders is an important question that I think people are just beginning to understand now. And finally, the applicability of these data outside the Ontario University context, the findings suggest that social media channels are used at these schools very similar to the way they are in the corporate world, which at least suggests that it's plausible that these findings are consistent with dynamics at other organizations. To put it another way, it's unlikely that Ontario institutions are somehow unique in using social media completely differently than the rest of the world. And so there are two main recommendations that came out of the study. One is future research. This is, admittedly a niche topic at the intersection of numerous fields. And there are a lot of opportunities to dig at some really specific dynamics at play here. Some examples might include, how does social media strategy affect employee perception, satisfaction, trust, those kinds of feelings toward their organization? How does it motivate employees? What is the impact of an organization making a statement about a current event like COVID-19 or social justice on its employees? These could all really be explored in depth, especially employing more quantitative methods and with greater sample sizes than the ones in this study. Some of the questions asked directly by the study could also be answered. These are things that specifically came out of what these practitioners relayed. Does the impact of featuring employees in social media content justify giving them a greater role in defining that content strategy? Do you consult people because ultimately the HR impact of featuring them in social media content justifies taking a certain chunk of that strategy and including them there? There are other questions, like what risks are involved to your brand if you do this, or do you risk turning off followers because they say, this just isn't relevant to me anymore to hear about these employees? And, should more resources be devoted to engaging these internal stakeholders and giving them an understanding of what the organization is doing from a strategic standpoint and why? Secondly, going beyond the literature, the data suggests a real opportunity for workers in this field to take ownership of a major PR function of their organization. There's a real opportunity here for these workers to kind of entrench themselves as critical pieces of the places they work. And, beyond just the opportunity for workers to do that for themselves, the data suggests that doing this well could mean a number of benefits for both employers and employees. But they also suggest that the current systems that workers use for this task are primitive, underutilized, and frankly, we don't know if they're good or not. They're using these systems that a lot of them have designed because it's what works for them, but we don't have anything to cross-reference to or compare it with and know if these are really best practices or not. Some of the examples relayed by interviewees of these systems that really could be used to bolster their roles in the organization and really help out the organization. Things like collaboration with HR or other departments that actually are defined as owning internal communications. Collaboration with them on what's going to happen on social media that features employees and why, and how do we have the best systems to kind of engage people and make them feel like participants in that. One example that came up was the idea of having like an in-house reporter whose job it is to connect with the different departments. And you have somebody who's responsible for that. And it's maybe somebody who's really good at, two-way communication and being a good listener. Having somebody employed in that role could be a really critical part of the strategy. And then finally, publicly available social media strategy documents that clearly outline to their employees, what is the organization doing with its social media strategy and why, so that when people see this content, whether it's aimed at them or not, they can make sense of it. It helps them kind of make sense of not only what the company's doing, but their roles within it. I did briefly want to touch on some of the limitations of the study. Firstly, this is a small sample size and it's qualitative methods only. Secondly, looked at Ontario only. And thirdly, there were 9 universities and only 1 college in this section. And as I mentioned before, the reason for that is that staff at the colleges are unionized, which I didn't know until after I'd actually spoken to one of them. And so you might have different dynamics presented than the ones at universities if say some staff are part of the same union as the workers, actually doing social media. But so I didn't talk to anyone from any more colleges after that first interview, but I did keep the data from that interview because the themes that the interview presented were they were consistent. They helped me reach data saturation, and I thought they were still additive to the study. I don't think anyone should be under the illusion that these findings are, hard conclusive evidence about what's happening in this field. The point of the study was to search for themes until hitting saturation and then kind of identify where future study should take place. And none of these limitations prevent that study from doing that. And so as a conclusion, there's 3 main takeaways that I came away with. One is there's a need for future research about how external social media is used to communicate with internal audiences. And it's a need that I don't think can be addressed through the prism of any one field. It needs to account for human resources, social identity theory, stakeholder theory, and others. 2, I think there's a real warning sign here in that internal communication is being performed without ownership at a lot of organizations. And that means risk. That means risk to organizations, risking the way employers feel about their companies. It's going to be affected by social media strategy. And we need to know more about that and understand that dynamic a little bit better. And finally, there's an opportunity for practitioners to really play an important role in the PR process here, which I think is an important and exciting development for the field. And so those are the 3 main takeaways. Hope everyone enjoyed learning a little bit more about this topic as much as I did. It was, a fun few months to kind of dive into this and look at, an emerging topic that's surprisingly not as present as I would have thought in the, the current discourse. And yeah, thanks to everyone on the call for listening in and learning a little bit more with me.
Great, thank you very much, Brian, for your presentation, and perfectly on time. Well, close.
Almost.
And yeah, close enough for jazz, as we say. So that's great. Now we move to the first question, which will come from your supervisor.
Congratulations. A very informative study. It's an interesting field that I've paid more attention to since you started doing this. And I've had some conversation with some people in universities as well, but this notion of how can we do internal communication through social media a little bit better. So does your study now tell us that the dichotomy between internal publics and external publics is no longer relevant?
I think being consistent with the way you speak to those groups, that's another through line that I would describe as being important to this study, because going back to that idea of organizational risk, if you've got internal stakeholders that know a lot about the organization, they work there, they know a lot about it, and they see what's being communicated to external audiences as inconsistent with what they know about the company and the way they interact with it, that's a huge amount of risk there, right? Because you're risking people becoming jaded, becoming, losing faith in their organizations, just as one example. But there are other examples of the reasons that you need to have consistency in the way you communicate to those two groups. And so I think even if there is that some degree of inconsistency there, having that transparent dialogue with those internal stakeholders, so if they see that, at least they understand why. They understand why you're talking to your customers a bit differently than you would be to your internal stakeholders. Having that level of awareness at the very minimum, I think is something that's additive. And if you can't have exact consistency the way you speak to those two groups, at least having an understanding of why there might be an inconsistency there has tremendous value.
Thank you for that. Just focusing back on universities, colleges, post-secondary, and your understanding the literature on internal communications now, and what some of the best practices are happening within it. Universities have devolved governance structures, right, where control rests at a departmental level. And there's power structures within those as well. Can universities effectively do internal social media as their communication channels? Because you really can't command and control in the university.
Yeah, I think I spoke to one practitioner who, again, they didn't work at the overall institutional level. They work for an individual department, but they said that trying to maintain consistency in the messaging across channels when you've got these divergent goals and different priorities for the departments, that's really challenging. I think the big thing is that and this is me kind of putting my own practitioner hat on as much as it is a researcher. The big challenge I see facing these workers and people working in this field is that it's not necessarily about trying to use the channels as the way of specifically communicating with these groups. It's making sure that when those groups experience this content, when they see it, it's not giving them mixed messages. It's not giving them something that's inconsistent with what they're hearing in their employee newsletter, on the internet site, from what they're hearing from their manager on Teams. And so making sure that there's consistency across those channels so that there isn't rogue messaging and internal communication is not happening really differently between those channels. That's more the priority than I would say actually using those channels to specifically be the main way you communicate with employees and other internal stakeholder groups.
Okay, that's all I have right now, Alex.
Great, thanks, Terry. Now we move to your second reader, Professor Scholz.
Thank you, Brian. This has been really insightful. Thank you for doing this. And it follows on a theme, because we've had other capstone and other research in the past look at communications of presidents to key stakeholders, to students. We've had people look at communications across departments and how do you actually manage a consistent message within that. And I want to focus on that. So you talk about rogue messaging for a second. So let me zone in on that. And you talk about one of the roles is maybe you need a journalist focus to go out and talk to other departments to bring in insights. Did you find in your research that universities have, at the senior level or at some level, someone talking to all the different departments about what the external strategy is and whether it impacts on internal or not? But is there that sharing of information and someone's role, or is that a role that needs to be created as part of this process?
So I would say that in some examples, yes. I was impressed with again maintaining confidentiality for the participants. I can't say which institution, but there was one institution in particular where I was quite impressed with the level of sophistication of the communications apparatus between departments. At the same time, some institutions that's not the case at all. It's very ad hoc, and you've got I would describe two different extremes on the spectrum. You've got that in-house reporter role, but then on the other end, you've got triage, where there's just information coming in all the time, and you've got people spending a significant part of their job figuring out what do we do with this and what do we say about it on our external channels. And so I think, again, getting back to the literature, not saying a lot about this, and they're not really being best practices that exist, because again, I think, when people look at external social media, you can understand why they're not thinking about how it's used to talk to internal audiences. It's a very small percentage. The main thing from the study is that whether that's justified or not, as it's still happening, it's happening regardless. And so not having best practices established, you see a lot of organizations where, yeah, they've got a sophisticated system where you've got collaboration and communication at the top level, but you've got some where they don't. And that's because, at least partly because I think, this hasn't been established as a dynamic that's well understood, and people don't even know the impacts of it happening at their current institutions, currently.
Yeah, and I think universities are unique in some way. I mean, our organization uses external communications as an employee engagement tool as part of our process.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen our engagement increase since we've done certain types of external social media communication. So it's been great on that aspect. But universities, and again, going back to this rogue element, so you have two types of rogue elements. You have people who are doing brilliant work that should be amplified, but don't have the social media skills to do so, and their department social media person doesn't necessarily know what they're doing. So that's that call for that journalist piece. I really like that call. On the opposite end, you have, and I'm going to use a really extreme example, Jordan Peterson from the University of Toronto.
Sorry, I did not know
Martin's
that.
enjoying that one. You have, Jordan Peterson from the University of Toronto out in social media as a representative, well, maybe not so much anymore, but at one point, a significant representative of the University of Toronto as an employee within the University of Toronto. That could potentially affect how you feel about your organization, your engagement. So does this, is that just making this more important, what you're talking about? Or is there a way that external communication should be, and internal communication should be involved in understanding the role of individuals to tweet out as representatives?
I think so, and I think this applies to more than just internal stakeholders too. I think, one conversation I had with someone for the study was that, alumni are a really important part of this discussion too, because they're so invested in their degrees. They're so, you've got them on your wall, right? And having somebody out there, like you said, Dr. Peterson or some other, celebrity professor, you could say, somebody with a, even if they're not a celebrity, they just happen to be really good on social and people follow them. What they're saying when they've got
Alex Sévigny.
Yeah, sure.
I was going to say Terry Flynn, Alex Sévigny, yeah.
What they're saying when they've got the institution's name in their bio, that ultimately does have an impact on what people might think the institution is either endorsing or not endorsing or interacting in any way with what that person is saying. And I think what this underscores is having consistency between an individual and the institution in what they're saying. I think that's a pretty lofty goal. And I would love to see the communications apparatus that would enable that. Stopping short of that, I think that underscores the need for internal stakeholders, especially, to have an understanding of what their institution is doing on social media and why, so that in the case of inconsistency with, what somebody is saying, they know what the school's Twitter account is trying to do, or they know why certain stories get shared on LinkedIn, because they've been engaged in that process. They've been made aware of documents that kind of further explicate what they're doing. And so when something is rogue and something doesn't make sense of it, they can maybe understand why it's not consistent with what the institution is saying as an overall brand itself on those channels.
Great, thank you, Brian. Alex?
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge. I mean, the universities are difficult beasts because of intellectual freedom, right, and academic freedom. So while a professor is a tenured or not tenured and affiliated to a university, they still retain their complete individual freedom, at least nominally. And it's difficult to apply any kind of corporate discipline, and especially when it comes to messaging or point of view on faculty, because it kind of goes against the very fiber of the appointment, right? So I don't know how it's what I've discovered, this is just a comment more than a question, is that the role in academic communications, particularly internal ones, is to sort of motivate, inform, and impress the membership, so they would then go on and communicate externally in a positive way. But it's tough. I mean, Jordan Peterson has the right to do what he does, right? He, as an emeritus of the University of Toronto, is protected by academic freedom as long as he's not doing anything that breaks Canadian law, right?
I was going to say, I think that leaning into that dynamic may even be advantageous for institutions, because I think, that's something that you understand, but someone who works at the registrar's office or in athletics, they may not grasp the nuance between being consistent across different channels that represent the brand and making space for, academic freedom, making space for discourse. Documents that outline that as a priority for these institutions, that say to employees, part of being a world-class institution is that we engage, we have opportunity for differences of opinion, and you may see that in the people who represent the institution. And that's part of being a university. There may be an opportunity for that kind of messaging as well, so that it's less chaotic. If somebody encounters that, they're not thinking, man, this organization's all over the place. They could be thinking, well, that's part of working at a university. That's part of the context that this organization lives in. And so again, I think helping people make sense of social media. We're for most people, we're 10 plus years into this experiment of people being on these platforms and knowing them really well. People think that they have a really good understanding, especially ones who have spent a lot of time posting content of their own. Helping to those people, especially, to understand what it is the organization itself is trying to do on social channels, and helping them kind of make sense of the context that they're in. I think that's where the tremendous value is. It may not be in actually, harnessing the messaging so that it's consistent across channels, but, diminishing the impacts of what happens in those circumstances, like you mentioned, so that when people encounter those things, it's not completely chaotic.
That's a thoughtful answer. You know what I mean? I actually would even take it potentially a step further in saying that the reason that professors are always at the top of the Edelman Trust Barometer is because they have that unfettered freedom and protection to have objective, or even if they have strongly subjective, but truthful opinions, authentic opinions, right? So, but very thoughtful. Thank you, Brian. I appreciate that. Any further questions, Terry or Dave?
I'm fine, thank you.
Yeah, one last question though, and it's about organizational size. I mean, this is not for every organization, right? If you've got 50 people, I'm sure it's a different approach than if you have 28,000 people, right?
Absolutely. Again, maintaining the confidentiality of some of the people I spoke to, but I want to reference one. I'll try not to give them away. Somebody who worked for an institution with, call it, tens of thousands of students. This was a really different question for them than somebody who works in the business school of, a smaller university, right? You've got a lot more complicated, machinations at play of this strategy, and putting my own, taking my researcher hat off and putting on my own worker hat on. I work at a company with 28 full-time employees. This is a dynamic that I experience all the time, but it's easy for me to manage because I can accomplish a lot of the stuff I've talked about in this study in a day of meetings. That's not true for people who work at a large institution. I think what that underscores is the need for the sophistication of these systems, so that you're not asking these people working in this field to spend so much of their time just trying to sort out, okay, what's the implication if we do a Diwali post, but we don't do a Lunar New Year post? What are the implications of that, right? You need to have a strategy in place and documents that outline that strategy to these internal stakeholders, so that work is kind of being done for you. And you're not asking these people who ostensibly are just, in the business of, creating content and coming with, marketing plans and other kinds of things that, they're specifically being asked to do by the institution. They're not also spending their own time sifting through this very messy, complicated topic. And I think that's where, when I say that, taking a greater role in the public relations function of an organization, like that is public relations right there, right? That is engaging. That's trying to see around the corner, to use an MCM cliche that I've used a lot. And so trying to get people to do that as a PR function. I think that's what I mean by there being an opportunity for these people working in this field, because it's something that these organizations frankly need to do. And this is probably the group that's equipped to do it.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Terry and Dave, for your questions. Now we turn to the gallery for your questions, opinions, and comments. Anybody have anything for Brian?
Very respectful of the process, that they don't want to put their foot into it. Even though you'd think that Amanda McFarland, now that she's like a seasoned veteran of this, that she'd get a question in.
I was going to say two quiet galleries in a row today. Yeah. Now that is unusual. All right, hearing no questions or comments. Oh, sorry, Terry, go ahead.
I've got the room done.
Okay, great. So hearing no questions or comments, Terry's got the room set up for folks who are not going to join us in conclave while we discuss Brian's achievement in his capstone, and then we'll be back. We'll bring you all back in about 5 minutes.